By the 1890s, South Bend had become a city that you just might be able to recognize. There was a grid of downtown streets that would be recognizable more than a century later, handfuls of churches that would stand for more than 120 years, historic brick buildings that would turn over tenants, but retain the same rough red walls for 14 decades and counting. You'd recognize handfuls of houses on West Washington Street, but you'd be thrown by the unimpressive young trees that grew in front of them. You'd see Tippecanoe Place the way it was intended, not as a restaurant or a school or a headquarters for the Red Cross, but as one of the grandest private homes in the Midwestern United States. You'd recognize the grid of tightly packed houses in West Side neighborhoods. And of course, there's the shape of the curves of the river, perfectly sweeping through the city it birthed and built and powered. 25 years after it was incorporated, there was still a long way to go. But in many ways, South Bend had started to become the city that still stands today. There were telephones and running water, electricity, streetcars, paved roads, and full-time police officers and firefighters. The city's limits were narrower than they would eventually become, but they were certainly wider than the handful of city blocks South Bend had once counted as its own in 1865. South Bend boasted of itself as a first-class American city throughout the 1880s, although to be sure it was lacking a few of the amenities that a top-shelf city was expected to have. A proper library for one, a shining city hall for another, and a serene city park for a third. But by the late 1880s, there was another problem facing South Bend. And that's because in 1888, the city couldn't find anyone who wanted to be its mayor. 2 decades into the institution of the city's government, the mayor's office was still considered a part-time role, and it was certainly paid like one. The mayor of South Bend was paid less than line workers at Oliver, Studebaker, or Singer factories. The mayor of South Bend was paid less than half of what the city's full-time police officers and firefighters made. At the same time, the mayor of South Bend was expected to be on call 24/7, was expected to preside over the mayor's court as often as lawbreakers necessitated it, and was expected to execute all of the decisions of the city council. Those decisions had become exponentially more numerous in the quarter century since South Bend had been incorporated. And what did the mayor get for doing all of that work? A $400 annual salary and the constant eviscerations of the local press who seized on his every move. At that time, South Bend had 4 newspapers, 2 Democratic papers and 2 Republican papers. That meant that every major decision was almost certain to upset at least 2 editors and spawn a host of angry letters that would be printed for the masses and delivered to the mayor's home on a daily basis. It's hard to blame a person for not wanting the gig. South Bend's early history had been marked by mayors and councilmen who absolutely did not want the offices bestowed upon them. Alexander Napier Thomas didn't even make it through a single 2-year term before deciding he needed to leave town forever. Dr. Levi Ham famously pish-poshed the Democratic nomination before his election and re-election in 1880 and 1882, something we talked about in the 6th episode of this series. But that was nothing compared to the election of 1888, a political kerfuffle that saw an unprecedented number of declined nominations, and one that ended with the election of the most reluctant mayor that the city had ever seen. On May 7th, William Longley was inaugurated as the 8th mayor of South Bend, a Democrat who'd made it plenty clear he didn't want to be there. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Hellman, and during this 8-episode series, we're going to dive into the dawn of the city of South Bend, the first 25 years after its incorporation, through the lens of its first 8 mayors. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generous underwriting of all 8 episodes in this series by Andy and Tina Nickel of South Bend. And now, with all that out of the way, let's jump into the life and times and administration of William Longley, the first native-born Hoosier to lead the city, the Democrat who seized the office back from the Republicans, and probably the most unwilling mayor South Bend ever had. William Longley was born October 3, 1846 in Elkhart County, but moved with his family onto a farm just southwest of South Bend at the age of 7. He attended the Common School in Green Township as a youngster and graduated from the University of Notre Dame with a commercial degree when he was 21 years old. Upon graduation, he entered into the dry goods business of John Brownfield as a cashier and shopkeeper at the oldest and most popular grocery store in South Bend. By all accounts, Longley was kind, friendly, and well known throughout the city. Of course, you'd expect that. Will Longley was the most present cashier at the largest grocery store in a relatively small town. He married in 1871, and the South Bend Tribune remarked that the young Will was the prince of good fellows, and that he deserved the estimable young lady he had won. It was a rare bit of praise to be directed toward a Democrat from the overwhelmingly Republican Tribune, but then Longley was a popular guy, and maybe more important, his dad owned the building that the Tribune leased for its operations. That's right, the South Bend Tribune, then South Bend's premier Republican newspaper, was housed in a building owned by a Democrat. That conflict of interest notwithstanding, the Longleys had a legacy of being the most Republican-leaning Democrats the city had ever seen. William's dad, Andrew, was even nominated for a county office as a Democrat by a Republican convention. The Longleys existed in a kind of bipartisan utopia, loved by Democrats because they were Democrats, and liked by Republicans because that's who all their friends were. But it might have been a stretch to call a young Will Longley a Democrat or a Republican at all. If he had any political notions, he didn't show them, and if he had any political aspirations, he kept those well hidden too. Throughout his 30s, Longley's name only appeared in the paper in advertisements for the Brownfield grocery and in reference to his legendary status as South Bend's premier outdoorsman. He participated in and won several competitive pigeon shoots throughout the years. His exploits were newsworthy occasions, and the paper reported when he left town to hunt for ducks, then reported again on the hauls he brought back with him. William Longley was quite the shot, and I did the math. He is responsible for the deaths of more than 240 birds, and that's just the one that the newspapers reported on. When he wasn't shooting birds, he was fishing, and for the first half of his life, the only offices he held were on the boards of the Audubon Club, the Isaac Walton Fishing Club, and the Isaac Walton Boating Club. But something important happened for Will Longley when he sat in on those club meetings, when he outshot his competition, and when he waited in the brush to nab a deer. Whether or not he meant to, he rubbed shoulders with South Bend's elite, and more often than not, he bested them. There were very few arenas where the Studebakers looked up to anyone, but at the shooting competitions, it was Longley on the top of the leaderboards, not them. When it came time to gather up a posse for a hunting trip to the rapidly diminishing Kankakee Marsh, the influential business leaders of South Bend wanted Will Longley on their team, and his political allegiances were never even a consideration. It was not any political acumen, influence, or experience that brought him into relationship with South Bend's most prestigious figures. It was his skill with a rod and a bow and a gun. So, Will Longley was popular, well-connected, and a Democrat. That was enough to earn him the party's nomination in 1883 for councilman in the 2nd Ward. As a general rule, the council nomination in the overwhelmingly Republican 2nd Ward had been little more than a formality. Democrats were used to losing the seat, but the prevailing notion was that they needed to put together a full ticket, and so they wrote someone's name in that space anyway. Knowing he was going to lose the vote is probably the only reason Longley acceded to the nomination. So you can imagine how surprised he might have been when he won. over the incumbent Councilman Yant. You can imagine how much more surprised the rest of the city was when the Republican Tribune cheered the nomination, saying, "Yant could not have been defeated by a better Democrat than Will Longley, who has hosts of friends in both the parties." If nothing else, William Longley was indubitably well liked, and we should note again, his dad owned the Tribune's building. None of this is to sell him short. There are worse traits for political leaders to have than general likability and a record of getting along well with others. But despite those obvious strengths, Longley doesn't seem to have been terribly interested in his work as a councilman. During his 2-year term, he was absent more than any of his peers, and in the Tribune's summaries of each council meeting, his name appears less often than all the others. It was a fairly tepid and mediocre run on the council, one that ended after a single 2-year term when Longley lost by 66 votes to a Dr. Harris. Of course, to hear the Tribune tell it, the city had just lost a patron saint. Harris was elected by 66 plurality, and over not only one of the best councilmen the city has ever had, but one of its best citizens. A more honorable or upright man than Will Longley it would be hard to find, and no councilman was ever more conscientious in the discharge of his duties. In case you missed it the first 2 times I said it, it's worth saying again. The man's dad owned the newspaper's building. Anyway, as far as Will Longley was concerned, his political career had just ended, and that was probably exactly what he wanted. But as for the Democrats of the city, they might have been concerned with an awful lot of things, but it sure seems like they didn't care what Will Longley wanted. After the break, we're into the bonkers election of 1888. Dr. J.W. Franks is South Bend's first and only veterinary surgeon and animal dentist. He's the only man in South Bend who holds a diploma from a veterinary college, and he's recently moved his practice to the brick barn in the rear of the Studebaker Carriage Works. There you'll find a first-class hospital for sick and lame horses, and the only place that can cure sprains, ring bones, and tendon lameness. Calls accepted day or night and promptly attended to at telephone number 156. And now, back to A Bend in Time presented by the History Museum. William Longley had a lot going on in 1888. He'd finally received the promotion to manager at the Brownfield store after 20 years' employment. But more importantly, he had a pile of money he'd been squirreling away for a while, and he was about to invest it to go into business with an old hunting buddy. It would take a few weeks to iron out the details, but by the summer, he would be a partner in the newly organized A.C. Staley Manufacturing Company, the precursor to the Stevenson Underwear Mills. So, when his name was whispered as a possible Democratic nominee for mayor that same year, he shot the idea down the same way he shot down pigeons in the bush, quickly and directly. He told Democratic leaders specifically that he did not want the nomination, and if they did nominate him, he would not raise his hand or do anything to secure the election. He was far from the only South Bender to hold such an opinion in 1888. When J.C. Birdsell, founder of the Birdsell Clover Huller Works, was nominated as the Prohibitionist candidate that same year, he wrote a letter to the Tribune that noted he was surprised and annoyed to be so honored, then unequivocally gave back the nomination. The Republicans tried on a handful of candidates, each unwilling or unable to step aside from their day jobs to do the mayor's work. They finally settled on H.B. Myler, a retiree and a fishing buddy of Will Longley. So the Prohibitionists had no one. The Republicans had Myler, and with Longley out of the race, the Democrats would either have to choose a different candidate or try harder to persuade the candidate they'd already chosen. They settled on the second strategy. On their first ballot, the Democratic Convention chose William Longley as their candidate, then invited him forward to give a speech, daring him to deny the nomination in a room full of people cheering his name. For Longley, it would be even easier than that. He wasn't even at the convention. Realizing this, the convention sent people into the streets to find Longley, where they tracked him down, took him by the elbows, and marched him into the convention hall. A defeated Longley muttered a speech that the Tribune graded like this: "There wasn't much enthusiasm in Will Longley's speech, but then a man can't be enthusiastic when he is being made to run for an office he doesn't want." When Longley won the office with 58% of the vote, a majority of 853 votes, he still wasn't particularly interested in actually being the mayor. During his inaugural address, he mentioned that the office was imposed upon him, and admitted that as few as 2 weeks ago, he had no thought of ever again being involved with the city's municipal affairs. He called the job a wholly unsought assignment that he had misgivings about, then refrained from making any suggestions to the newly inaugurated council on account of he was not familiar with the current goings-on of the city. He was not off to a great start. But he was doing better than the Republicans. They'd suffered a monumental defeat to an unwilling candidate, and the editor of the Tribune couldn't even be bothered to come up with new words to describe his disappointment, rerunning a paragraph from several years prior that you might have heard in a previous episode of this podcast. "We have been worsted, whipped, most outrageously wailed. Sitting down on the business end of attack couldn't make Republicans feel worse." Then, they offered a warning for the new mayor. He will find the position difficult to fill, owing to the diverse interests which are continually clashing in a place the size of South Bend. He will find, too, more blame than praise. More curses than honor are connected to the mayor's office. He was wise in not wanting the office, and will be doubly wise if he can administer it to please all. It took a week for the newspaper's omen to come true. 7 days into his term, the Democratic majority on the city council carved out a new partisan position for a city rodsman who would serve beneath the city engineer to help with measuring things. Previously, the engineer had been permitted to hire his own help as he saw fit, and the newspapers were quick to wonder why the rodsman needed to have a political affiliation at all. But they answered their own question as soon as they asked it. The man appointed to the job was George Bernard, a lifelong Democrat who'd been squeezed out of a tight race for city marshal. The whole affair reeked of cronyism, and Will Longley took the brunt of the journalistic umbrage, even though he hadn't proposed the measure, hadn't spoken on it, and hadn't been called to vote on it. On the same day that he read through the angry editorial that pulled no punches and even suggested that he had put the milk in the coconut, he also received a paycheck for his first week on the job, $7.69 before taxes. And no, I don't know what it means to put the milk in the coconut either. The next few months were quieter than that first week. The South Bend Toy Company moved its operations to High Street. The Staley Manufacturing Company that Longley was involved with boasted production of 240 pairs of underwear per day. A new iteration of the public library opened on the 4th floor of the Oliver Opera House. The nation voted to put a Hoosier into the White House when Benjamin Harrison won the presidency, but lost the popular vote. In November, the Indiana paper mill on South Bend's East Race caught fire when a worker unknowingly pushed an iron-wheeled truck over a parlor match that someone had carelessly dropped on the floor next to a pile of oil-soaked rags. It's hard to imagine a more flammable situation than a match and a heap of oil-soaked rags in a poorly ventilated building constructed with wood and absolutely filled with paper. There was never anything the fire department could have done. The blaze was over quickly, leaving behind a total destruction. It was a miracle that no one died, and far more people were hurt rebuilding the structure than during the moments when it came down. The mill reopened just 4 months after it was reduced to ashes. By 1889, South Bend crossed a population threshold, topping 25,000 people for the first time in its young history. There wouldn't be much time to celebrate. The year began with high drama in the city council over the use of salt to melt ice on the tracks of the street rail. The council had banned the practice, calling it injurious to horses' hooves, public health, and the integrity of paved sidewalks. The railway came to fight that decision, and they brought with them their lawyer, a man who was more than familiar with the proceedings of the city council. Representing the railway was none other than William G. George, the first mayor of South Bend, and when he walked into the chambers that he had helped to establish, he was already in kind of a mood. George started out hot, calling the whole mess ridiculous and dismissing the council's arguments as imaginative hogwash. The council shot back with a pair of angry rebuttals that served to heighten the intensity of the proceedings. Councilman Williams, for one, said he thought the railway had a lot of gall to come before the council to ask for a favor, but he wouldn't get the chance to finish his sentence. While mopping the perspiration from his heated brow, George shot from his seat and interrupted, bellowing, "Gall!" And I'll let the newspaper account take it from here. And then, in very ungentlemanly, discourteous, and unprofessional terms, ex-Mayor George sneeringly alluded to Williams as that gentleman from the 15th Ward who would be privileged to ride to his home in the suburbs if he had so much as a nickel to his name that he could drop in the slot, etc. The words etc. are actually printed there, and that's really unfortunate, because I desperately want to know which insults the newspaper refused to print. Either way, the tantrum did not seem to help the railway's cause. The matter was referred to the Committee on Public Improvements, where it stalled and died. The papers derided Mayor Longley for failing to call George to order during his tirade. March delivered South Bend back into the national spotlight when it was announced that Benjamin Harrison would be delivered to his inauguration in a custom Studebaker carriage, one of a long line of presidents who chose Studebaker carriages. Harrison had made the trip to South Bend, visiting the Studebaker residence to place the order, dropping a little more than $7,000 on carriages and gear. Harrison chose a Landau model for himself, a Brougham model for his wife, and added a Victoria model and a male Phaeton model to his order, just for good measure. Harrison rode the Landau to his inauguration. Mrs. Harrison's Brougham is on display in the permanent collection at the Studebaker National Museum. Just as importantly for the proud people of South Bend, and more importantly for Will Longley, Harrison would be sworn in while wearing a pair of woolen underwear from the A.C. Staley Manufacturing Company. If other presidents preferred Staley undies the way they preferred Studebaker carriages, we don't know. So far as I can tell, and I looked into this way more than I should have, Benjamin Harrison is the only American president whose inaugural underwear choice was public knowledge. A few weeks after Harrison's rear end sat in and on a pair of South Bend-produced goods, a seemingly inconsequential thing happened during a city council meeting, but it was one that would alter the course of Mayor Longley's life and bring a bit of tarnish to his legacy. In March 1889, Sam Leeper introduced to the council the idea of brick-paved roads. The key selling point was that brick roads would need to be repaved and maintained less often than the graded gravel roads that were most common in the day. Longley seized on this idea with an uncharacteristic degree of passion, involvement, and excitement. For the remainder of his tenure, he'd go often to street paving conventions and demonstrations, pushing the council to make the move to longer-lasting brick roads. The council followed Longley's lead and made a long-term plan to repave many of its downtown streets with hard-fired brick during the next decade. A few weeks after Mayor Longley left office, he was fully incorporated with Sam Leeper as the city's largest brick maker, and the handful of brick streets that remain in South Bend today mostly came from their factory. But that controversy was still a few years away as of 1889. That's when Mayor Longley cracked down on the practice of naked people bathing in the river, winning rare support from both Democrats and Republicans. He also banned firecrackers, earning rare derision from both Democrats and Republicans. After all, the Indiana paper mill had burned down with a parlor match, and Longley wasn't banning those, was he? August 28th marked a historic day in northern Indiana with the opening of Studebaker Park in Elkhart. This was not a good look for South Bend. They'd acquired the land that would later become Howard Park years ago, but had taken no action toward its improvements. The place was still being used as a dump. Now Elkhart had a park that came as a gift from the Studebakers, no less, and South Bend still had no park. That's when Alexis Coquillard came to the rescue, or at least when he tried to. Alexis Coquillard, nephew of the Alexis Coquillard, founder of South Bend, offered to donate land on the east side of South Bend for development as a city park, noting that it was something the city needed if it was going to be as great as it wanted to be. But his donation came with strings attached. Coquillard had watched everything that had happened, or more accurately, hadn't happened, when the city acquired parkland last time, and wanted to be sure the same thing didn't happen with his land. As part of the terms of the donation, the city would have to invest a certain number of dollars in improvements in a certain amount of time, or else the land would revert back to Coquillard's estate. Politically, it was a disaster. Some were upset that a single rich person could affect so much power in telling the city what it had to do. Some were upset about the tax burden that this would place upon the entire city, even though the park was near the remote northeastern corner of the city's limits, inaccessible by the streetcar system, and too far away from the working families on the west side who no doubt would be the ones feeling the impact of increased taxation most acutely. Then there were the other voices who clamored that this was way too good of an opportunity to pass up. The issue bubbled into something beyond Republican versus Democrat. It turned into East Side versus West Side, and when the vote to acquire the land finally made it to the floor of the city council, the place was filled to standing room only with onlookers. The council settled into deadlock, voting to a 5-5 tie. Mayor Longley would have to cast the deciding vote. He chose to accept the land, making half the city very, very happy, and making the other half very, very mad. The city struggled to fund the necessary improvements. The land very nearly went back to the Coquillard estate, and Coquillard Park did not open until 1906, 17 years after Coquillard donated it and after the man had already died. Today's Coquillard Park, east of the old Pearly School, sits on the same land that Coquillard donated all of those years ago. And from there, the hits just kept coming. Clem Studebaker's Tippecanoe place was burned and gutted on October 9, 1889, a $300,000 loss. Workers set to cleaning out the place immediately, dumping all of the refuse at the place that would later become Howard Park. By October 15th, Studebaker was apparently already over it, appearing before the city council to offer land for another city park, this one in the Sunnyside neighborhood, also on the city's east side. His offer came with a set of conditions similar to the ones Coquillard had laid out, and this time the council would turn down the donation on the grounds that they'd just established an East Side Park and that they still didn't have a plan in place to fund the improvements needed for that one. Doubling the new park tax burden for a second East Side Park would have been political suicide for Democrats on the city's west side, and if they didn't win the west side, they would never win anything again. The measure was voted down by the council and did not require Longley to break a tie. But he was still the face of the city government, and as far as the people saw it, he just made half the city very, very happy and half the city very, very angry. The problem was, angry feelings tend to last longer than happy ones. Will Longley had started his term as maybe the most well-liked guy in South Bend. Now everyone had a reason to oppose him. He needed a win, and he was about to get one. After the break, South Bend goes international. Get the only underwear that President Benjamin Harrison wears to his inaugurations, with wool briefs from A.C. Staley made here in South Bend, available now at the Boston Dry Goods Store. We also have merino underwear, scarlet underwear, ribbed underwear, and medicated underwear, all at the best prices. Visit the Boston Dry Goods Store at 127 South Michigan Street, the leaders of low prices. And now, back to A Bend in Time presented by the History Museum. James Blaine's 1884 presidential campaign hadn't turned out the way he wanted. Despite the warm welcome he'd received in South Bend, a parade featuring gauntlets of plumed knights, women dressed in fairy whites, thousands of lit torches, and 40,000 cheering supporters, he dropped the general election to Grover Cleveland by some 37 electoral votes. But that didn't mean his political career was over. Blaine was installed as Secretary of State when President Harrison moved into the White House in early 1889, and Blaine was planning to do some significant work once he got there. Blaine's first act was to convene a Pan-American Congress filled with diplomats, politicians, and business leaders from across South and Central America. His goal was to build a Western trade alliance that could assist in keeping wealth on this side of the Atlantic and to provide avenues for peaceable solutions to future conflicts. In October 1889, the historic Pan-American Congress was assembled for a weeks-long tour of the United States. Blaine had opened bids to every city in the country, inviting them to make their case, explaining why the Pan-American Congress should stop over in their town. There was only one hard and fast rule in place for applicants. Towns had to have a population of at least 50,000, with exactly one shining exception: South Bend, Indiana. South Bend was determined as a stopping place from the beginning because, to quote Clem Studebaker, it had the largest plowmaker in the world, the largest toy maker in the world, the largest clover huller production in the world, and the largest vehicle maker in the world. Studebaker might have fudged the numbers just a little bit to get to all of those accolades, but it wasn't hard to win over a James Blaine who'd once toured the entirety of the United States and never received a welcome like he had in South Bend. The people of South Bend knew the event was a big deal, but they couldn't have known how big. Besides featuring a handful of Washington's top-ranking officials and America's biggest titans of industry, the international delegation contained at least 5 South American presidents, 1 prime minister, and 3 secretaries of state. During a whirlwind tour of the city, the delegates toured the factories of Studebaker, Oliver, Singer, South Bend Toy Company, and A.C. Staley. They visited the El Bell Music Store. When it was time to break for lunch, there was only ever one place that could host a collection of so much prestige: Clem Studebaker's extravagant home, Tippecanoe Place. But, as you'll no doubt recall, Tippecanoe Place had just burned. The Congress arrived 10 days after the fire had been extinguished, and 6 days after its burned-out guts had been removed and dumped at the city park. The outside of the building was in fine condition. Huge stones don't burn. But there had been no time to correct the matter of the home's insides, and to Clem, it made no difference. The most consequential international delegation South Bend had ever seen ate lunch in the charred remains of his home. And then they were off to the next city. 1890 brought another election and another victory that Will Longley didn't really want. He was at Notre Dame on May 30th of that year when its iconic Golden Dome was dedicated, hosted public celebrations when North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming all became U.S. states. He helped cut the ribbon when the Miller-Knobloch Wagon Company was opened. He prosecuted a few naked riverfolk. He sat in on secret conversations with James Oliver when the plowmaker shared his intention to bring an extravagant hotel to South Bend. When the deal fell through, controversially, it was Longley that took the heat. The story went that Oliver had selected a location and shared that location in confidence with a few high-ranking city officials. By the time he started to try to acquire the properties he needed to make his dream a reality, the cat was somehow out of the bag. One property owner jacked up his price, knowing who wanted to buy the land and why. Feeling betrayed by the city, Oliver pulled out of the deal. Everyone involved denied leaking the story, but the damage was done. The Oliver Hotel would be stalled for another 8 years. March of 1891 brought more difficulty when Singer announced that it was employing more than 1,000 people and that its factory was at capacity. Usually that was good news because that meant a new factory was going to be built, and that's exactly what was going to happen. But this time, there was some conversation that the new factory wouldn't be in South Bend. Higher-ups at Singer thought about moving operations to Cairo, Illinois. It would take the intervention of Singer general manager Leighton Pine, the same man who successfully won the standpipe bet that left Clem Studebaker soaking, to keep Singer in South Bend. He broke his operations into 2 shifts and instituted an 8-hour workday for all employees to relieve pressure on the building until a new factory could be built. By the time the new factory was built in 1901, the 8-hour workday had become something of a standard, and the Singer factory was the first one to get there. As the clock ticked down on Longley's second term, he entered into conversation with the nearby town of Myler, a loosely organized village to the south whose limits rubbed against South Bend's at Indiana Avenue. Just before Longley left office, Myler would agree to be annexed by South Bend, the single largest acquisition of territory in the young city's history. There was going to be a lot of work involved to bring the new land into the city, but that would be a problem for the next mayor. Despite the pleas from Democrats that he should run again, Longley was finally able to convince them to find someone else. He wouldn't be the one charged with the actual work of bringing Myler into the fold, but he would make sure his new brick-making firm was able to supply the hard-fired bricks the city would need for all the new roads it was going to have to pave. Will Longley lived another 43 years after he stepped away from the mayor's seat, long enough to see the dedication of the city hall, the opening of the parks, the building of the library, and the completion of that Oliver Hotel. He watched Studebaker phase out wagons in favor of cars. He watched South Bend go through a world war and a depression. He watched 10 more mayors sit in the seat that used to be his. But he watched from a distance. When his tenure as the city's mayor ended, so did his involvement in local politics. William Longley died on August 17, 1935. He is buried in the Highland Cemetery. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Hellman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Thanks to Andy and Tina Nickel of South Bend for underwriting this episode and all 8 episodes in the series. This is our final episode in the Dawn of the City series, which covered the years of 1865 through 1892 in South Bend, and I hope you've had as much fun listening as I did putting each of these together. Our next series will talk about some of the forgotten businesses of South Bend, and I hope you'll tune in for those episodes too. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.